Imagine this, you walk into a luxury boutique, look at the merchandise, when suddenly the manager comes up to you and asks you to leave. He makes it clear that you are not welcome here, simply because of the way you look. But here's the catch, he has no idea that you are not just a customer, but the new owner of this store. How would you respond to such injustice? Do you remain calm or do you reveal the truth right away? Let's look at how this story unfolds and what it teaches us about bias and the forces that lie beyond appearances. What would you do in the place of the heroine of this story? Write your thoughts in the comments. The manager looks at the woman with disdain, not doubting for a second that he is right. He repeats coldly, "Please leave our store. This is not your place." She remains silent, pausing, and simply smiles. Something in her confidence makes him tense up, but he continues to act on inertia, without asking unnecessary questions. The woman doesn't argue or make a scene. Instead, she slowly takes her phone out of her bag and dials a short number. The manager hears her quietly but confidently say from afar, "Yes, it's me. Come on over. We have a little problem here." A few minutes later, a luxurious black car pulls up at the entrance. Several men in formal suits get out and head straight for the woman. All the store employees start whispering in surprise and alarm. The manager begins to realize that something is wrong, but it is too late. "Now," the woman finally says, looking directly at the manager, "let's talk about who's really out of place here." The manager, noticing the luxury car and the delegation of people, froze in place. At first, he thought it was one of the VIP clients, because such visits were not uncommon in their boutique. But when he saw that all these people approached the very woman he had just thrown out, something inside him turned over. The woman stood quietly, a slight smile on her lips, while one of the men in an expensive suit bowed respectfully before her and said something in her ear. Her gaze slid around the boutique, as if she were assessing the situation, and finally stopped at the manager. He suddenly felt his stomach tighten, as if a premonition of disaster was about to become reality. "I can see that you're doing a great job of managing," she said slowly, approaching the manager. "But tell me, is it standard practice for you to fire customers based on their appearance?" "I'm sorry," he stammered, confused, "but, we have very strict rules about who we serve. I'm just following established procedures." "Established procedures?" she asked, her expression showing no irritation, only obvious curiosity. "And who do you think established these rules?" The manager was at a loss. He tried to find the right words, but he felt the situation becoming more and more threatening. The rest of the store employees held their breath, watching the scene, feeling that something was out of the ordinary. "Let me help you," the woman said, taking a small step forward. "I made these rules. My name is Victoria Williams, and I'm the new owner of this boutique. I came here today to meet the staff and see how things are run. And you know what? I didn't like the way I was greeted." The manager's face turned white, as if all the blood had drained out of it. His breathing became ragged, and his hands, involuntarily clenched into fists, began to tremble slightly. "Owner," he barely managed to say, "this is some kind of mistake." "There's nothing wrong with that," Victoria continued, her voice firm, "but your reaction is the problem. You decided to judge me by my appearance. You didn't bother to find out who I am. And now you're in a difficult position. Like so many others, you made an assumption based on bias, and that could cost you dearly." At that moment, one of her people approached her, holding a folder of documents. She signed a few pages and handed them back, then addressed the entire store staff. "I want each of you to remember this. It doesn't matter what a person looks like or what their background is. If someone walks into this boutique, they deserve respect. That's how I plan to run this business. Those who can't accept these rules can leave." She looked at the manager again, and his heart sank in anticipation of the inevitable outcome. "Well," Victoria said calmly, "I suppose you'll have to make one of those decisions right now. Will you stay and change, or will you leave?" The manager stood there, speechless. His whole world had turned upside down in an instant. The gravity of the situation had completely overwhelmed him. Finally, after a long silence, he swallowed the lump in his throat and forced out, "I am ready to change." Victoria nodded, smiling slightly. "I hope you are serious, because this is the last chance. And remember, this is no longer just a luxury boutique. This is a place where every person will be met with respect." The manager, pale with excitement, nodded and took a step back, trying not to meet Victoria's eyes. She looked at him appraisingly once more, and then turned away, nodding to her assistants. The tension seemed to ease a little, but no one knew that something far more dramatic was about to happen. The next day, Victoria visited the boutique again to begin restructuring the store. She ordered the dismissal of several employees who shared the manager's views and established new rules. However, on this day, something happened that no one expected. The manager she spared felt that his position on thin ice was an injustice he could not bear. His whole world, all his self-confidence, had collapsed the moment Victoria exposed him in front of everyone. He could no longer cope with the shame that had fallen upon him and the unbearable sense of guilt that was eating him up from the inside. His life outside of work was also far from ideal. Debts, family problems and chronic stress had taken their toll. The tension built up like a spring, and that evening, after the store closed, he was alone in the office. He sat at his desk in the semi-darkness, staring into space, a bottle of cheap whiskey in his hands. His thoughts were a jumble of chaos: his career, his pride, his future. Victoria, who had long since left the store, was at an evening meeting in her office. She was sure that everything was going according to plan, that after a strict lesson the store would live a new life, getting rid of old prejudices. But she did not know that during this time, in the dark corners of the manager's mind, a real tragedy was beginning to brew. Late in the evening, when all the employees had left, the manager made a terrible decision. The very office where he had been humiliated only yesterday was visited by law enforcement agencies after a call from one of the security guards who had noticed something strange. Victoria arrived at the place, not even suspecting what awaited her. When she entered, an officer with a serious face came out to meet her. He asked her to go into the office. The air was unbearably silent. The manager lay motionless and cold-blooded on the floor, surrounded by broken glass. An empty bottle and several handwritten sheets of paper lay nearby. It was a note. Victoria knelt down next to the body, shocked by what she saw, and picked up one of the notes with trembling hands. In it, he asked for forgiveness, confessed that he had failed to cope with life, that shame and disgrace had destroyed him from the inside. But at the end there was a phrase that struck Victoria to the depths of her soul. "You gave me a chance to change, but I could not forgive myself. Now you are the only one who can fix what I destroyed." Victoria looked up from the note, feeling a weight of guilt and helplessness. She never wanted it to end this way. She wanted justice, change, and instead she lost a man who couldn't overcome his own demons. Now she understood that behind every fight for justice there was a human life, with its own weaknesses and pain. That day changed Victoria forever. She continued to grow her business and fight injustice, but her view of the world changed. She realized that change doesn't always come without pain, and that sometimes bias destroys not only those it directly affects, but also those who created it. After the tragic incident in the office, the atmosphere in the store changed dramatically. The news of what happened quickly spread among the employees, and everyone felt the oppressive shadow of the events. People were silent, worked like machines, but no one discussed what happened openly. It felt like this incident left deep wounds that could not heal. Victoria couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt, even though she knew her goal was righteous. She wanted justice. She wanted to change the store, to make it a place where everyone felt respected, regardless of skin color or social status. But the manager was a victim not only of bias, but also of his own weakness, and it was a heavy blow to her. Every day she came to the office, but she felt the past weighing on her. It seemed to her that the manager's shadow remained within the store's walls, a reminder that change always comes at a price. Victoria increasingly stayed late, restless, trying to process the bitterness of loss and mistake. Despite her outward fortitude, deep down she felt empty. One evening, a few weeks after the incident, Victoria was alone in the store, lost in thought. It had long since grown dark outside, and only the dim light of a desk lamp illuminated her office. She looked at the documents, but the words blurred into a meaningless stream. Thoughts swirled in her mind that perhaps she had gone too far in her quest for justice. Yes, she wanted change, but who would have thought that one correction of a mistake would lead to such tragic consequences? At that moment there was a knock on the office door. Victoria raised her head, slightly startled. At such a late hour she was not expecting anyone. "Come in," she said, trying to keep her voice confident. The door slowly opened, and one of the store's senior salespeople, Anna, a woman in her 40s who had worked here since the first days, appeared on the threshold. She had a thoughtful and slightly worried face. I'm sorry to bother you, she began quietly, but I need to talk to you. It's about what happened. Victoria motioned for her to sit down, feeling her shoulders tense. This conversation was bound to happen, but she didn't know if she was ready for it. What do you mean? Victoria asked calmly, although a storm was raging inside her. Anna hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words so as not to make the situation worse. We all know that what happened was a terrible tragedy, she began. But you see, this manager, he had problems long before the day you fired him. He had been struggling with depression for years, and no one knew about it. On the outside, he seemed strong, cold, sometimes even cruel, but inside, he was broken. These words struck Victoria. She wondered, had she been unfair to him? Perhaps she had become the last straw in a series of personal and professional failures. She remembered his arrogance, his prejudice, but now it looked different, like a mask hiding his inner struggle. None of us are making excuses for what he did, Anna continued, seeing Victoria's thoughtfulness. He did make terrible mistakes, and you were right to want to change the store, but I think it was more complicated than what we saw on the surface. Sometimes when people are faced with change, they break. Maybe he just couldn't cope. Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears, but she held them back. Taking a deep breath, she looked at Anna and said quietly, I didn't know. If I had known, maybe I would have acted differently, but now nothing can be changed. Anna nodded sadly, looking at Victoria with understanding. It's not your fault. You fought for what you believed was right, but I think it's important to remember that everyone carries a burden that isn't always visible. That's a lesson for us all. After Anna left, Victoria sat in silence for a long time, thinking about her words. She realized that she could no longer continue to ignore what had happened. Despite all her efforts to change the store, she realized that the changes she so desired should not break people, even if they ended up on the other side of the barricades. The next day, Victoria held a meeting of all the employees. She stood before them, not hiding her fatigue and grief, and spoke. I can't undo what happened, and I can't take away the guilt that haunts me, but I want you to know that I was sure that I was doing the right thing, but I didn't see the man behind his mistakes. That was my failure. The room froze in silence. People looked at Victoria, some of them also struggling with internal pain and loss. She continued, I want to change the store, to make it a place where there is no room for prejudice, where every person can feel respected. But I also want there to be a place for compassion. We must remember that behind every action there is a story that we do not know, and sometimes people need help, not judgment. Victoria exhaled, feeling her words finally free her from a heavy burden. This wasn't just a store, it was a place where she wanted people to not only buy expensive things, but also feel human warmth. And now she realized that real change doesn't start with policies or rules, but with heart and compassion for everyone who walks through the doors of her business. This story remained forever in Victoria's memory. She continued to develop her business, but now her approach to people changed forever. She knew that success is not only profit and prestige, but also the ability to see a person behind his actions, and this lesson became the most important in her life. Several months had passed since the tragic death of the manager. The store, which had once been a symbol of luxury and status, was now permeated with a gloomy atmosphere. Every morning, Victoria came to work with a heavy heart. Her dream of creating a place where everyone is respected turned into a nightmare that she could not forget. Victoria tried to move forward, new employees, ethics training, changing store policies, but the shadow of the tragedy remained. Every time she passed the office where the manager had killed himself, her mind returned to that day. She felt as if she had missed something important, that her actions had been the catalyst for his despair. No matter how many times she was told it wasn't her fault, she couldn't shake the feeling. One of those nights, when Victoria was again late at the store, immersed in her work, something strange began to happen. It was a subtle, almost elusive feeling, as if someone was looking at her from the darkness. She raised her head, but saw no one. The feeling grew stronger, leaving a cold mark on her soul. One night, when she was alone in the office again, Victoria heard the door creak slightly. Although she was sure that no one else was there, she tensed, listening carefully. Footsteps weak, barely audible, as if someone was slowly approaching her office. Victoria tried to pull herself together, but she could not suppress the strange tremor that took over her body. Suddenly, a figure appeared from around the corner. It was a security guard. I'm sorry, Miss Williams, he said in a controlled voice. "But I thought you'd already left. Is everything all right?" Victoria nodded, trying not to show her nervousness, although her heart was beating so hard that it seemed as if it would burst out of her chest. The guard paused at the door for a moment, then bowed and left, leaving her alone. However, the feeling of anxiety did not leave her. For several nights in a row, Victoria began to have nightmares. In them, she returned again and again to the office where the manager lay. In her dreams, she saw his face pale, exhausted, but his eyes burned with accusation. He looked at her silently, and his gaze was full of reproach. She tried to talk to him, but she could not utter a word. Every time she woke up, her chest was squeezed by a feeling of guilt and despair. One night, the nightmare was especially realistic. In the dream, Victoria found herself back in the office. Darkness enveloped her, but a dim light was burning on the desk. She came closer and saw on the desk the same note that the manager had left before his death. But now there was something new in it. In a crooked, trembling handwriting, he had added a few words. "You don't understand. This is not the end." Victoria woke up in a cold sweat, her heart clenching in terror. She was sure it was just another nightmare brought on by guilt. But the next morning, something had changed. When Victoria arrived at the store, she noticed that the employees had become nervous and quiet. One of the saleswomen, a young girl named Lena, approached her with a frightened face. "Miss Williams," she began, her voice shaking, "I don't know how to say this, but some of us saw something strange in the store last night." Victoria frowned, trying to understand what was being discussed. "What exactly did you see?" she asked, trying to speak calmly. "Shadows," Lena whispered. "Footsteps. Doors that open on their own. Some employees say they heard a voice. The voice of that manager." The words pierced Victoria like a knife. It was impossible. They were just rumors, born of fear and tragedy, but a strange feeling flared up inside her. What if it was true? A few nights later, Victoria decided to stay in the store one more time to see what was going on. She took only a small lamp with her, illuminating the office, and sat down at the desk that had once been occupied by the manager. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet, but then she heard it again, those same footsteps. Light, as if someone was moving along the corridor. Victoria held her breath. She stood up and walked out into the hallway, the lamplight wavering in her hands. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to her. She stopped at the door that led to the office where he had killed himself. Victoria took a deep breath and opened the door. The office was empty, but there was something strange in the air, a slight chill that went right to the bone. Victoria took a step inside, and suddenly the lamp in her hands began to flicker, as if the battery was failing. And at the very moment when the light finally went out, she heard a quiet, whispering voice behind her. "You don't know the whole truth." Victoria froze, unable to move. She slowly turned her head, expecting to see the manager's figure, but there was nothing behind her. However, the air around her was filled with a heavy, ominous energy. Something or someone was pressing on her from within, as if she was under someone's gaze. When the light came back, Victoria saw a note on the table. It was the same piece of paper she had seen in her dream, but this time it said, "I'm not gone, I'm here." It was the last straw for her. Victoria realized that this store was more than just a place to trade. It held something dark inside, something that had not gone away since the manager committed suicide. She could no longer ignore these strange phenomena. Everything that happened seemed to be a signal something was left unfinished, and until she sorted it out, she would not be left alone. Victoria decided that she had to find out the truth. Victoria held her breath as she stared at the note lying on the table. A feeling of dread filled her, as if an invisible force was squeezing her chest. She was sure that this note was part of her nightmare, but now it was right in front of her, in the real world. The words on the sheet, written in a trembling hand, were like a challenge, as if someone was watching her even at this moment. She realized that this couldn't go on. A desperate desire grew inside her to uncover the truth, to understand what had really happened to the manager, and perhaps finally to rid herself of the guilt that had haunted her for all these months. The next day, Victoria decided to look into the store's archives. She knew the former manager had been there for many years, and there was something about his history that had escaped her attention. She felt the whole situation was too complicated and confusing, and her decision to fire him was just a catalyst for something darker. Victoria contacted the accounting department and requested old documents and reports for the past few years. Her intuition told her that if there was something hidden in the manager's past, it would show up in financial reports or personal files. After several hours of looking through dry numbers and reports, her attention was drawn to strange transactions that led to several hidden accounts that no one knew about. These transactions were regularly transferred to unknown offshore accounts. She continued digging through the documents, and something stirred her consciousness. The manager not only kept double-entry bookkeeping, but also participated in a money laundering scheme. Victoria felt a chill down her spine. It turned out that the money he was withdrawing was connected to criminal structures. It was millions taken out of business through various machinations. Now things started to add up. The manager wasn't just a man with personal problems, he was involved in dangerous and illegal activities. His anxiety and strange behavior were probably due to the fact that he felt he was about to be exposed. His dismissal was not only a blow to his pride, but also jeopardized his illegal dealings. Perhaps he knew his past was about to come to light, and this was the last straw for him. Victoria began to suspect that his death might not have been a suicide at all. But if so, who was behind it? Her head was full of questions, and she decided to do what should have been done from the beginning: contact a private detective and start an investigation. The next day, a detective named Jason arrived at the store to inspect the office and examine all the evidence. He was an experienced detective and immediately realized that the case was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. Together with Victoria, they decided to study the surveillance footage from the day of the manager's death. As they began to review the footage, Jason noticed something odd. The manager had not been alone in the office a few hours before his supposed suicide. The camera had captured a woman entering his office, a young woman with a cold, determined expression. They were arguing, gesturing. The footage showed the manager writing something and then handing her the paper. Victoria felt her heart sink. This could have been the moment he wrote his suicide note. But what happened next shocked her to the core. The camera showed that a few minutes after the manager finished writing, the woman suddenly grabbed his hand and pulled out something that looked like a syringe from her pocket. She injected something directly into his neck. The manager tried to resist, but he was too weak. A moment later, he collapsed on the floor, and the woman calmly left the office without looking back. Victoria froze, not believing her eyes. What they saw turned everything upside down. The manager hadn't just been murdered. He'd been forced to write a note that looked like a suicide note. To make it look like suicide. "This isn't just any woman," Jason said, zooming in. "Look, she has a tattoo on her arm. It's the mark of one of the criminal gangs." Victoria couldn't believe that such shady business was happening right under her nose. She realized that she had become a pawn in someone's game. Now it was clear why he had looked so broken in recent weeks. He was under pressure, but not only because of his work. He knew that he was being watched and could be taken out at any moment. The detective investigated further and found out that this woman was connected to the very criminal structures through which the manager laundered money. He was probably trying to get out of the game or betray them, and they decided to get rid of him so as not to leave witnesses. However, the investigation did not end there. Victoria, feeling like part of the sinister game, began receiving threats. She began to be haunted by anonymous calls and strange messages hinting that she knew too much. One morning, while driving to work, a black SUV cut her off, and after narrowly avoiding an accident, Victoria realized she was the next target. But instead of giving in to fear, she decided to take action. Victoria contacted the authorities and handed over all the evidence she had collected, including CCTV footage and financial documents. She knew she was at war with a dangerous organization, but it was too late to back out. And so, a few weeks later, the criminal network was exposed. Arrests followed one after another, and lengthy trials followed. Victoria lost her store, but saved her life and learned an important lesson. Behind every luxurious facade there can be dark secrets. However, despite solving the case, Victoria was still unable to completely get rid of the strange feeling of anxiety. Every time she went to bed, she still dreamed of that manager with the reproachful look, as a reminder that in life, not everything is always as simple as it seems at first glance. Despite her victory in uncovering the criminal network, Victoria's life did not return to normal. Although she had handed over all the evidence to the police and the culprits were behind bars, something continued to haunt her at night. Sleep brought no relief each time she saw the same person, her former manager, who, despite the fact that his killers had been arrested, still appeared in her dreams, looking at her with reproach. These dreams became increasingly tormenting, making Victoria feel that she had missed something important, something that remained hidden in the shadows of what had happened. A few weeks after the arrest of the criminal group, Victoria began to notice strange things. At first, these were small details. Her personal belongings at work were moving from one place to another. The lights in the store turned on and off by themselves. She attributed it to fatigue and overexertion, but soon the events began to take on a more sinister character. One evening, after a long day at work, Victoria returned home to find an unfamiliar envelope sitting on her kitchen table. She didn't remember receiving mail that day, and she certainly didn't leave it there. Inside was a single photograph. It was a snapshot taken in the store several years ago, when the manager was still on the job. It showed him smiling next to a young woman, the same woman who would later be implicated in his murder. On the back of the photograph was a note written in the same hand that had written the suicide note. "This isn't over yet." Shocked, Victoria immediately called Jason, the detective she worked with. He agreed to meet her the next day to discuss this new development. Meanwhile, Victoria tried to maintain her composure, but fear was beginning to take over. She knew the criminal network had been exposed and there was no trace of them anymore. So who was continuing to threaten her? The next day, they met Jason at a cafe near her house. He studied the photo carefully and shook his head thoughtfully. "It's strange," he said. "I've personally checked everything connected with this case. Everyone involved in the scheme is behind bars, but someone is clearly playing with you." "And what could that mean?" Victoria asked, feeling cold sweat begin to run down her back. "It could be someone we haven't accounted for," Jason continued. "Someone who's been in the shadows of this entire investigation, or someone who wants you to believe the case isn't closed." The next morning, Victoria returned to the store, looking for any clues that might shed light on what was happening. Everything seemed normal. The employees were working, the customers were choosing items, but the air was still filled with the same tension that had appeared after the manager's death. Suddenly, she heard a whisper. At first, quiet, barely audible, but it grew louder and closer. It wasn't just a sound, it was his name. The whispers were everywhere, filling her mind. She jumped up and ran out into the hallway leading to the very office where it all began. As soon as she approached the door suddenly began to slowly open by itself. Victoria walked inside, barely suppressing the growing panic. The room was silent, but there was something unnatural in the air, like the presence of someone invisible. And then, on her desk, she saw another note. This time the words were clearer, written in large, confident handwriting. "You must know the truth." Victoria's heart began to pound so loudly that it seemed as if it would burst out of her chest. Questions raced through her head. What is the truth? Hasn't she revealed everything? What other secret could be hidden behind this whole dark story? Victoria began digging through the archive, hoping to find at least some new information. Hours flew by, but there were no new leads. However, when she was ready to give up, her gaze fell on an old, slightly tattered folder, lost in the corner of the archive. It contained many documents concerning financial transactions that seemed insignificant to her. But one name was repeated again and again, the name of a young man named Carter. Carter had been working at the store since before Victoria arrived, and records showed he was involved in some personal dealings with the manager. However, his name soon disappeared from the records, as if he had been erased. Victoria had no recollection of ever meeting him, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he was connected to the store, the manager, and perhaps much more. She found an old photo of Carter, a tall, sullen guy with a sharp gaze, but something about his face seemed familiar, and then it dawned on her. This man, Carter, was on surveillance footage the day the manager died. He was one of the people who came into the store before the tragedy, but because he was insignificant, no one noticed his face. Now Victoria understood. Carter was the last missing link in this puzzle, but where was he now, and why had he started stalking her? She shared her suspicions with Jason, and they began looking for information about Carter. It turned out that after he disappeared from the store, he changed his name and began working for one of the small-time criminal groups that remained in the shadows after the arrests. He harbored a grudge against Victoria for firing his close friend, the manager with whom he was involved in the scam, and now Carter was sure that Victoria played a role in the fact that everything did not go as planned. Everything that happened to her was Carter's revenge. He manipulated the facts, scared her, planted notes, trying to drive her crazy and make her believe that the case was not over. Carter had one goal: to drive Victoria to despair and break her spirit, just as the manager was broken. But now that Victoria knew the truth, she couldn't let him win. Victoria, realizing that Carter was behind all of this, decided to take action. Now that she knew she was being haunted by a vengeance from her past, she needed to find a way to catch Carter and end this horror once and for all. She and Jason continued their investigation, and soon they had information that Carter had been spotted in several places related to his new activities. Her next goal was to find him and bring him to justice. Victoria decided to start with Carter's inner circle. Jason suggested that she go to one of the clubs where Carter allegedly spent time. The club was in an area known for its criminal connections, and it was difficult to get into, but Victoria was determined. One night at the club was a test. Locals and street gangsters filled the place, creating a loud, menacing backdrop. Victoria tried to look invisible, watching the crowd for any sign of Carter. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a man who looked like he belonged there for a reason. Tall, with a grim expression and tattoos on his arms. It was him. Victoria's heart began to pound, but she kept her cool. Using her experience and stealth, she watched Carter, trying not to attract attention. Carter seemed to have important business, because his manner and demeanor were determined and tense. She followed him as he left the club and headed into a small building nearby. Victoria stood in the shadows and waited for him to enter, then cautiously approached the door and knocked. A few minutes later, the door opened and Carter peered out, clearly surprised that someone would knock in such a neighborhood. "Do I know you?" he asked, trying to determine who was in front of him. At that moment, Victoria did what she had planned beforehand. She signaled Jason, who was hiding nearby, and he, following her signal, drove up to the building with several police officers. They surrounded the building to prevent Carter from escaping. Carter, noticing the movement around him, tried to escape, but Jason and his team were faster. After a short but intense chase, Carter was apprehended. He tried to resist, but ended up in the hands of the police, and Victoria was finally able to learn what he was really up to. When Carter was questioned, his behavior became more open. He admitted that all along he had been trying to intimidate Victoria to divert attention from his own activities. He was part of a more complex scheme than just revenge. His goal was to create chaos and confusion enough to hide the larger operations he was involved in. As details emerged, it became clear that Carter was one of the last links in a large criminal network involved in illegal financial transactions and real estate manipulation. He used his revenge as a cover for his own crimes. He had one more big hit planned, one that could completely change the balance of power in the criminal world. But now that he was caught, his plans were ruined. Carter's trial was the culmination of the whole story. With the evidence gathered by Victoria and Jason, not only was Carter convicted, but the entire network was exposed. The situation seemed to have been resolved, but it was only the beginning of a new phase for Victoria. Even though the law was restored and the criminals got what they deserved, Victoria felt that her life would never be the same again. She made the decision to leave the shop that had become the source of so much suffering for her. But instead of just leaving, she decided to use her knowledge and experience to help others. She opened an organization that provided support to victims of crime, which helped people who found themselves in similar situations. It was her attempt to find peace and make up for what she saw as her mistakes. She knew her life would never be the same again, but now she had a purpose that could give meaning to everything she had experienced. Victoria's story ended not just as a victory over crime, but as a personal transformation. Her courage and determination ultimately helped not only her, but many others find hope and support during difficult times. With her new organization, she continued to fight for justice, becoming a symbol of how even the darkest moments can be overcome and the light can be found despite the darkness. It had been several months since Victoria had opened her organization to support victims of crime. She had thrown herself into her work, helping many people recover and cope with the aftermath of violence and crime. A new chapter in her life had begun, full of hope and the fight for justice, but suddenly her world was plunged into darkness again. One day, while going through reports and letters from victims, Victoria came across a disturbing message. It came from a woman named Laura, who claimed that her husband had gone missing, and all the evidence pointed to possible links to organized crime. Laura was in a panic and asked for help to find her husband and find out what had happened to him. The message was unusual not only because of its disturbing content, but because it was signed by the same name Victoria had seen in old documents related to Carter. Putting the pieces together, Victoria realized that Laura was more than just a victim. Her husband was a contact who might have information about undisclosed aspects of the criminal network, and that network might still be active. Victoria immediately contacted Laura. The woman was desperate and willing to do anything to find her husband. During their conversation, Victoria learned that Laura's husband, Michael, worked for a company that was allegedly connected to the same criminal structures as Carter. He had recently started an investigation as part of his job and had been threatened before disappearing. Using her contacts and resources, Victoria began her own investigation. She discovered that Michael was conducting his own investigation, which could uncover something serious. While examining his work records, Victoria noticed that Michael had discovered strange financial transactions involving several high-profile companies and their executives. These companies appeared to be part of a larger plan aimed at money laundering and tax evasion. Victoria also noticed that Michael was in regular contact with several people whose names were associated with the same criminal groups as Carter. She discovered that one of these people, a well-known underworld character named Lucas Sterling, was the mastermind behind the money laundering operation. His name was on many of the hidden lists and notes found after Carter's arrest. After gathering information, Victoria turned to Jason for help. They hatched a plan to uncover this new scheme, assuming that Laura might be in danger and that her husband had been kidnapped to keep his silence to ensure the criminal operations continued. Victoria and Jason set up surveillance on Sterling and his entourage. They soon found information that Sterling frequented an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The location seemed ideal for secret meetings and covert operations. One night, Victoria and Jason went to the building, hoping to find Michael and deal with Sterling. They carefully entered and discovered that the building was being used as a base for illegal operations. In one of the rooms, they found Michael. He was alive, but looked exhausted and scared. He was tied up, and it seemed like they were trying to silence him. But before they could free Michael, they were discovered by security guards and a fierce shootout ensued. Victoria and Jason barely managed to overcome the guards and free Michael. After a tense fight, they escaped the building and called the police. Shortly after, Lucas Sterling was arrested and his ties to the criminal network were revealed. He proved to be even more dangerous than Carter, and his arrest put an end to many of the illegal operations. Michael was rescued and, although in shock, was able to recover with the help of Laura and Victoria's support. Investigating and freeing Michael was a landmark event for Victoria. Not only had she saved one life, but she had helped unravel part of a larger pattern of crimes, which allowed more mysteries to be solved and other culprits to be caught. She felt a sense of accomplishment in making a difference and preventing criminals from escaping justice. However, Victoria knew that her work was not finished. Now that her organization had become more well-known, she continued to fight for victims' rights and help those who needed support. The changes she brought to society, uncovering criminal schemes and helping people, became her new purpose in life. And although traces of the dark past still occasionally reminded of themselves, Victoria found the strength to continue on her path. She did everything possible to turn her pain and suffering into strength that helps many others. Thus, her story turned from a story of personal struggle into a story of resilience and hope, inspiring others to seek justice and fight for their future, despite any obstacles. After Victoria and Jason saved Michael and exposed Lucas Sterling, it seemed like the dark times were behind them. But in reality, their fight was just beginning. Behind the facade of justice, there was something deeper and more dangerous that left Victoria haunted. Over time, her organization attracted the attention of many people and organizations. As she worked on new cases, she noticed that the cases of violence and crime were becoming more and more complicated. One day, a client showed up at her office claiming that his wife had gone missing. His story was vaguely familiar, but Victoria couldn't remember where. While trying to understand this new case, Victoria discovered that this missing person was connected to a case she had worked on before. The woman who had disappeared was connected to people who were involved in Lucas Sterling's criminal schemes. She was in danger, and Victoria felt that the case was connected to the same criminal structures she had encountered. In her search for the truth, Victoria discovered that there were more powerful people behind Sterling's actions. They were part of a secret network operating internationally, using sophisticated schemes to launder money and traffic people. The criminal underworld was far more complex and far-reaching than she could have imagined. Victoria grew increasingly worried with each passing day. She began receiving threats that became more explicit and threatening. Someone did not want her work to continue, and it seemed to be someone with unlimited resources and connections. One day, Victoria returned home to find that her apartment had been ransacked. Although she saw no obvious signs of a break-in, her personal belongings were in disarray and important documents were missing. Fear took over her mind. She knew that these actions were not only aimed at intimidation, but also at destroying all evidence and evidence. Together with Jason, she decided to tighten up security and take precautions. They rented a new, more secure office space and set up 24/7 surveillance. However, even this could not prevent new challenges that soon began to come. One day, when Victoria returned home after a long day of work, she found a strange envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a new, frightening element, a note with a photo of her own family, taken several years ago, when her parents were still alive. The note contained a threat: the next victims are those you love. Stop what you are doing or we will start with them. Victoria was in a panic. She knew that her family could now be a target. Her father and mother lived in another city, and she immediately contacted them to ensure their safety. They agreed to move to a more secure location until the situation calmed down. Soon after, Victoria discovered that her new documents and materials had also been stolen. Jason was determined and reached out to his law enforcement contacts to step up their defenses and launch a full-scale investigation. They also began looking for ways to identify and catch those behind these threats. Despite the increased security, the criminals continued to operate. One night, as Victoria was walking down a deserted street after work, an unknown man was waiting for her in the shadows. She managed to notice him at the last moment, but the man managed to escape, leaving her with an even greater sense of danger. Gradually, Victoria realized that her work had led her to the heart of the problem, and that her enemies were becoming more determined to stop her. She felt that a new, more dangerous stage had begun in her fight against crime. Her entire life was now part of a fight for justice that threatened to consume her entirely. One of the most difficult parts of this period was her personal crisis. Victoria was losing her sense of normalcy, her former joys, her relationships. Her own inner experiences began to be erased under the pressure of constant fear and pressure. She began to break off relationships with old friends who did not understand her new problems, and her dedication to the cause led to internal exhaustion. Jason managed to find information that the criminal network they were fighting had connections to high-profile politicians and businessmen, which made the case even more dangerous. They began collecting information and looking for evidence that could help expose the entire network. Meanwhile, Victoria increasingly felt that her work was beginning to consume her entirely. She could not sleep at night. She was haunted by nightmares, and every morning she began with anxiety about what would happen next. She realized that her determination and fight for justice had become her only source of strength, but also her greatest burden. One day, after a particularly difficult night, Victoria found that she could no longer cope with the pressure. She felt that her strength was running out and decided to seek help from a psychologist to cope with post-traumatic stress and internal conflicts. This was her first step to regaining her mental balance. Psychological support proved to be a valuable resource. Victoria began to understand the importance of her own self-care and the need to find a balance between her personal life and work. She realized that her health and well-being were important not only for herself, but also for those she sought to protect. With the help of Jason and her professional advisors, Victoria was able to regain control of the situation. They continued their investigation and soon uncovered a major part of the scheme that led to the arrest of several high-profile individuals. These arrests brought public attention and helped to establish her organization as a major player in the fight against organized crime. Still, Victoria knew her journey to recovery was just beginning. She continued to work, but with new ways to care for herself and her loved ones. Her life would never be the same, but she learned to find strength within herself and in the support of those around her to continue the fight for justice and to cope with the challenges that life presented her with. Victoria's story became an example of courage and determination, and her journey from personal tragedy to personal transformation inspired many. she realized that despite all the challenges, true strength and victory lies in the ability to maintain humanity and find light even in the darkest moments. After Victoria exposed the criminal schemes and freed Michael, it seemed that her life could return to normal, but the peace was temporary. The dark side of her fight against organized crime did not leave her alone, and tragedy soon returned, consuming her life with a new force. Even as Victoria's organization continued to function successfully, her own life began to crumble. The number of threats increased, and each new warning became more alarming and personal. The internal experiences and constant sense of threat had a significant impact on her mental state. One day, Victoria returned home to find that her apartment had been ransacked yet again, but this time, there was something more terrifying. Written in red letters on her kitchen wall was "See you soon in hell." The note was addressed to her, and its content was not just a threat, but a promise of fear. In an attempt to cope with the situation, Victoria decided to seek help from a psychologist and begin a course of treatment to cope with post-traumatic stress. But even professional help could not prevent the catastrophe that would soon befall her life. A few days later, while Victoria was in the office, her assistant, 26-year-old Sophia, came to her with bad news. Sophia was close to her and was one of the organization's first employees. This time, she brought news that made Victoria's heart beat faster. Her apartment had been burglarized, and, even more terrifyingly, Sophia had disappeared. Victoria immediately contacted the police, but the search was unsuccessful. Sophia's abduction was a new blow to Victoria. She felt responsible for what happened, since it was her actions that led to such consequences. In her eyes, this was proof that her fight for justice had led to irreparable losses. Despite police efforts that lasted for weeks, no one could find any trace of Sophia. The fruitless search and growing guilt only made her feel worse. Victoria felt devastated, and every morning she began with the realization that her dedication to the cause had cost the life of her loved one. As time went on, Victoria began to receive new threats. This time, they concerned her family. She continued to receive letters with photos of her parents and threats against them. Realizing that her loved ones could be the next victims, she tried to increase their security, but fear and hopelessness began to consume her. Then, in one of her darkest moments, another terrible thing happened. Victoria received a phone call from an unknown person. On the other end of the line was a man with a raspy voice who said that her mother, Eliza Beta, had been seriously injured in a car accident. Victoria immediately rushed to the hospital, but alas, her mother was in critical condition. During the days she spent in the hospital, Victoria watched her mother fight for her life. Her condition worsened, and the doctors were relentless in their prognosis. Victoria was in complete despair, and the fear of losing her loved one became even more real and unbearable. Finally, after long and agonizing hours of waiting, her mother passed away. The tragedy that befell her was another blow that Victoria could not bear. She lost not only a loved one, but also the feeling of confidence that she was doing everything possible to protect her loved ones. The feeling of guilt for what had happened became more and more unbearable. Victoria's condition continued to deteriorate. She became depressed and isolated, unable to cope with the loss and fear. Her organization suffered in her absence, and the work she loved began to crumble. Friends and colleagues noticed her deteriorating condition and tried to help, but Victoria became increasingly withdrawn. Finally, when all seemed hopeless, Victoria made the decision to leave her organization and a job that had consumed her life. She realized that she could not continue the struggle that had left her in a state of emotional and physical exhaustion. She decided to move to another city to start a new life away from all reminders of her past. Saying goodbye to the organization and her former colleagues was tragic. Victoria knew that her departure would leave many people without support, but she was unable to continue the fight. She left in search of peace and a new beginning, but she knew that her past would always be with her, a dark reminder of how dangerous and destructive the pursuit of justice can be. Victoria's tragic story left a deep mark on her life. She lost a lot, but also gained an understanding of the importance of caring for herself and her loved ones. Her journey through darkness and pain was excruciating, but it also taught her about the fragility of human existence and how sometimes the greatest victory is the ability to find peace within despite external challenges. After Victoria left her organization and moved to a new city, she sought to find peace and rebuild her life. However, even in this new beginning, she was unable to completely shake off the demons of her past. The dark events she had experienced had left a deep mark on her, and every new beginning seemed to be overshadowed by the memories of what had happened. The move was difficult and she faced many challenges, from finding a new place to live and a job to trying to regain her mental balance. Victoria chose a small coastal village where the people were friendly and calm. She hoped that the peaceful landscape and the slow pace of life would help her recover. At the beginning of her new stage in life, Victoria got a job at a small library, which was located in the very center of the village. Work in the library was calm and measured, and Victoria enjoyed the silence and solitude that she could find among the books. It gave her the opportunity to immerse herself in reading and remember what was once dear to her. One day, while working in the library, Victoria came across an old book with a tattered cover that someone had accidentally left among the books on the shelf. It was a book about old local legends and mystical events associated with the village. Inside was a notebook with notes and newspaper clippings related to ancient crimes and mysteries that happened in these places many years ago. Victoria was intrigued. The book contained descriptions of mysterious disappearances and murders that had occurred in the village in the 1920s. These events seemed to have no explanation, and many of them were linked to an ancient conspiracy that allegedly spanned several generations. Reading this book awakened long-forgotten feelings in Victoria. She began to explore the local archives and library, and her interest grew stronger. Ancient secrets and incessant questions about what happened caught her attention. Being involved in the investigation, she felt that her inner conflict and need to find the truth made sense again. During her research, Victoria met a local historian named George. He was an elderly but lively man who knew many stories about the village and its past. George proved to be a valuable ally, helping Victoria with the archives and explaining local legends. Together, they began to unravel the complex web of ancient mysteries. As Victoria and George delved deeper into their investigation, they discovered that many of the ancient crimes described in the book had parallels with modern events in the village. There was a sense that the dark forces that had once been at work here might be revived. One day, while exploring, Victoria and George stumbled upon a hidden underground cave that was mentioned in ancient texts. The cave was a mysterious place where mystical rituals were supposedly performed. Inside, they found ancient artifacts and documents that pointed to the existence of a secret society engaged in covert actions and manipulations. With each step, their investigation became more dangerous. Victoria and George began to receive warnings that their actions could lead to trouble. Soon, strange events began to occur in the village: disappearances, explicit threats, and even attacks on people connected to their investigation. One evening, when Victoria returned home, she found that her apartment had been broken into. All her documents and records had been destroyed, and a threat had been left on the wall: leave the past, or you will pay the price. Fear and a sense of danger returned to her life. Victoria knew that the dark forces she faced would not stop there. Despite all this, Victoria and George continued their investigation. They discovered that the secret society was still active and that their actions were aimed at maintaining control over the village and its inhabitants. It turned out that this society used ancient rituals and manipulations to maintain their influence and power. One day, during her last investigation, Victoria discovered that George had been murdered. His body was found in an underground cave, and traces of ancient ritual signs were visible on his body. This was a terrible blow to Victoria, who lost not only a friend, but also an important ally in her fight for the truth. After George's death, Victoria continued her investigation alone. She knew she had to find a way to stop the secret society and prevent further tragedies. Using the remaining evidence and archival materials, she was able to identify key members of the society and expose their plans. Victoria eventually turned over all the materials she had collected to law enforcement. Thanks to her efforts, many crimes were solved and the secret society was destroyed. Although she managed to get to the truth and put an end to a dark era, the price was high. The loss of George and the constant feeling of being threatened left her with deep emotional scars. Eventually, Victoria decided to leave the village and move to a quieter place where she could start a new life. Free from her dark past, she knew that her fight for truth and justice had left deep marks on her soul, but she also knew that her efforts had helped many people and put an end to ancient atrocities. Victoria's story is a testament to how the pursuit of truth and justice can lead to great sacrifices, but also to significant changes. She left behind a legacy of courage and determination that will inspire others to fight the forces of darkness and seek the light in even the darkest situations. After Victoria left the village and its dark secrets behind, she thought she had found the peace she longed for. But life, as it turned out, was not going to let her go so easily. Her new start in the big city began with finding a new job and regaining her lost peace of mind. At first, everything went well. She got a job at a small private detective agency that helped people solve private cases. The work was less stressful, and Victoria was able to find a new rhythm of life. One day, while Victoria was doing her usual business, her attention was drawn to a strange message on her agency's website. It was from an anonymous sender and contained a request for help. The message stated that mysterious disappearances were happening in a large city, and the sender was concerned that powerful and dangerous forces were behind it. Despite her fears and desire to leave the past behind, Victoria felt that this case required her attention. The letter seemed familiar, reminding her of ancient mysteries and dark deeds that she had encountered before. She decided to accept the challenge and began her investigation. Victoria soon discovered that the missing people were connected to an elite club run by powerful and wealthy people. The club had a reputation for being a closed society where secret deals were discussed and dangerous ideas were debated. It was a place full of paradoxes. On the one hand, it seemed prestigious and high class. On the other, its secrets were dark and dangerous. During her investigation, Victoria discovered that the club was involved in a series of strange and dangerous rituals related to ancient traditions and occult practices. These rituals were aimed at gaining power and influence, and their participants were willing to do anything to achieve their goals. With a new partner, a talented journalist named Alex, Victoria began to unravel the club network. Alex was smarter and bolder than most of the people she had worked with before. His ability to extract information and find clues was incredibly valuable. Together, they spent countless hours gathering evidence and uncovering dangerous connections between the club and high-profile politicians and businessmen. However, as their investigation deepened, it became clear that they were in a dangerous game. One of the first steps they took was to discover that the club was using its members as pawns in a complex game of manipulation and pressure. The missing people, it turned out, were victims of this dark conspiracy, and their disappearances were part of a much larger plan. One day, when Victoria and Alex are about to hand over their findings to law enforcement, their plan is uncovered. They become the target of a powerful group of mercenaries hired by the club to protect their secrets and eliminate those who threaten their business. Victoria and Alex find themselves in a tense race against time, where every move they make could be fatal. Victoria and Alex went into hiding, trying to find ways to secure their evidence and survive. In one nighttime operation, they set up an ambush to catch a high-profile member of the club who could reveal key details of the conspiracy. It was a crucial operation, but it turned into a tragedy. During the arrest of a club member, Alex was wounded. Although Victoria managed to obtain important evidence, her partner was in critical condition. His injuries were severe and he was taken to the hospital. Victoria was in despair, feeling that her fight for truth and justice had already cost too much. Alex was not only her partner, but also a close friend, and her heart was breaking from fear and helplessness. Meanwhile, Victoria, having learned of Alex's condition, continued to fight despite the pain. She returned all the collected materials and evidence to law enforcement, who were eventually able to conduct a large-scale investigation and expose the club's criminal schemes. Several high-profile figures were arrested, and the club was disbanded, but the fight came at a high price. Alex, unfortunately, never recovered from his wounds. His death left Victoria in deep grief and loneliness. She realized that her activities had led to a great tragedy and that her own life had been changed forever. Victoria continued to work at the agency, but her former sense of peace and satisfaction was replaced by constant pain and regret. She continued to struggle with herself and her inner demons. The time spent with Alex left an important legacy in her life. Victoria learned to appreciate moments of happiness and find strength in difficult times. She realized that even with great sacrifices, her work helped many people and led to important changes. A few years passed, and Victoria began a new chapter in her life. She opened her own detective office, specializing in helping people in difficult situations. Her new cases were calmer, and she tried to help those who needed justice. She learned to find a balance between her work and personal life, and despite her sadness, she was able to find meaning and joy in what she did. Victoria's story became a testament to how a person can go through dark times and learn to find the light even in the darkest of situations. Her determination and courage left a deep mark, and her journey was an inspiration to many. Victoria continued her work, knowing that every victory and every step towards justice was important and valuable. After many trials and tribulations, Victoria was finally able to find long-awaited peace and happiness. With her determination and strength, she built a new life full of hope and meaning. Her work in the detective agency became not only a source of income, but also a way to make a significant contribution to the lives of others. A few years later, Victoria opened her own detective agency, which quickly gained a reputation as a reliable and honest partner in resolving complex cases. Her experience and dedication attracted many clients, and she helped many people find justice and resolve their problems. Her office became a symbol of hope and help for those who found themselves in a difficult situation. Victoria also didn't forget about her past. She decided to use her knowledge and experience to teach others. She began holding workshops and lectures on how to fight injustice and overcome difficulties. Her stories and lessons inspired many, and she saw how her efforts helped people find the strength to change their own lives. One day, during one of her workshops, Victoria met a young man named Jack, who was looking for meaning and direction in his life. Jack was inspired by her story and decided to become her assistant. He was full of energy and desire to help people, and together with Victoria they began working on new projects aimed at improving life in the community. In their work together, they organized many events and programs aimed at supporting people in difficult situations. They worked with charities, launched training and counseling programs, and contributed to the development of the local community. Victoria's life was full of meaning and joy. She learned to appreciate every moment and find happiness in simple things. Her successes and achievements were the result of her hard work and self-belief. She surrounded herself with people who supported her and shared her values, and this became an important source of happiness and satisfaction for her. Thank you for being with us throughout Victoria's fascinating and challenging story. I hope you found her journey as inspiring and meaningful as I did. Victoria was able to overcome incredible challenges and build a new life of happiness and fulfillment, and this is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What moments in the story stood out to you the most? What lessons did you learn from her journey? And how do you deal with challenges in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories and inspiring stories. Your likes and comments help us create more content that can touch hearts and change lives.